This program is underwritten in part by Garthco Push magazine for those who want to stay well informed, coming to a newsstand near you.
The Marshallese were the guinea pigs for America's nuclear testing. Today, behind their smiles, is the reality of radiation, suffering, and death.
But ladies and gentlemen, we would not be discussing Clarence Thomas if he were liberal and a Democrat. His crime is he is a Republican and he is conservative.
We're not talking about being a State Department and ambassador or a greeter at the White House. We're talking about somebody who's going to Supreme Court of the United States to decide cases.
Amazing grace.
And you know, whites in the movement in the South sometimes experience even greater wrath of the racists than did the blacks. Well, because the whites resented what they saw as one of their own, crossing the line and hooking arms or embracing the struggle of the black people in the South at the time. They saw them as traitors, nigger lovers they called them.
Good evening, I'm Del Marie Cobb.
I'm Darrell Denard. Welcome to Street Life, a quarterly news magazine with a fresh perspective of world and national developments. Among the stories we'll cover this edition of Street Life, a Memphis museum keeps the dream of civil rights alive with one-of-a-kind exhibits. It's a place to remember.
We'll take a look at how the appointment of Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court highlighted divisions within the African American community on how best to achieve the quest for equality. Naming a child can have serious consequences. What's in a name could be a label or a legacy. We'll show you. But our top story tonight, Paradise Lost, residents of a small string of islands struggle with a nuclear legacy given to them by the United States.
For the past several decades, the United States government has systematically destroyed a Pacific island paradise with its testing of nuclear weapons.
But now the residents of those islands are starting to feel the profound effects of such testing. Street Life correspondent Art Cribbs has the story of the atomic atoll.
These are the children of the Marshall Islands, a string of necklace-like atolls in the Central Pacific, halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines. In their faces, you can see the history of conquest and domination. A century ago, the Germans were here. In the first half of the 20th century came the Japanese. After World War II, the Americans took over. That is when life for these people shifted into a nightmare.
Deep down inside, they think we are savages. There was a man came to our island taking pictures, and in that tape he incorporated these military pictures in there, which classified Marshallese as savages. My brother was the mayor at that time, and he was classified as a very nice savage.
Almost 5,000 miles away at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California, Americans fired nuclear weapons. The target, the Marshall Islands. For 10 years, this nation was ground zero.
Those islands in the Pacific were sparsely populated compared with most of the rest of the world. They had to be lands under United States control. The population had to be small enough to be manageable in terms of it being physically reasonable to pick people up and move them to another place for a period of time.
I was examined about 2 years ago, and they found out that all the bones in my body, I'm having cancer now, bone cancer they call it, for cause that I am not told what. They said I'm sick because of the bone cancer. But I don't know what causes it. I don't feel very well today.
Precautions had been taken and continued to be taken in all of the testing that I ever participated in to assure that no people anywhere, whether they were Americans or Marshallese or any other nationality, no people would be injured by these tests.
The Marshallese were the guinea pigs for America's nuclear testing. Today, behind their smiles, is the reality of radiation, suffering, and death. Jetanan Jong is a senator in the Marshall Islands legislature. In 1954, he was exposed to radiation from the U.S. nuclear testing.
About 2 years ago, there was a baby born. Their face looked like frog. And we don't know what caused that. We believe it's caused by something, by the nuclear fallout that we encountered in 1954. But DOE at that time said, no, that was not the cause.
Roger Ray is a scientist and the former site manager of nuclear testing grounds in Nevada and the Marshall Islands.
We conducted 66 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands over the period of 1947 to 1958, and but one had this tragic effect. I'm not proud of that one, but I am proud of the great effort that was made following that to learn lessons from it and to build in safety precautions so it should not happen again. And I'm even more proud of the effort that has been made to redress that accident.
Despite the misery of their reality, the Marshallese cling to love, hope, and hospitality.
Sometimes it's very difficult to see how God's love really works in this kind of situation.
Jory Lokbok is the principal at the Marshall Christian High School on the small island of Rongrong, about 50 miles from this nation's capital in Majuro. Here, a group of 13 high school students from the United States experienced generosity uncommon in their homeland. They came here in the summer of '91 to participate in a week-long work camp. They painted classrooms as they learned about the traditions and the history of this country's people. By American standards, the people of the Marshall Islands are poor. On Rongrong, there is no running water. There is no indoor plumbing. There is no electricity. Yet there is no sense of poverty, because the 300 students who attend school here bring the depth and history of a culture whose custom is to give abundantly. The Marshallese generosity was almost too much for the American students to believe and receive.
I was taken by the gifts, not just the gifts of like necklaces and reeds and stuff, but like the gifts of song and how much that was appreciated instead of the material things.
They treated us so nicely and gave us all the food that they had, yet when it came to their own people, they only gave them a bread or drinking bread. So that kind of giving, touched me.
The Americans were given beds when there were no spare beds. So some of the Marshallese students slept outdoors under the stars and on some nights in the rain. They were given water to bathe and drink, although the Marshallese must depend solely upon the rain for their source of water.
Like in the bathroom, you have 3 pails and that's basically it. And you just use what you need, and as far as brushing teeth, you have some in your canteen and you don't use much.
Instead of bitterness and hatred toward the Americans for foreign policies that threaten the life and livelihood of the Marshallese, the people here believe in love.
They tend to believe that it's part of their life. It's something to make their culture even better.
It is possible that many of us in the United States may never have heard of the Marshall Islands, or never may have given much thought about these people. There are reports here that the Marshall Islands government may agree to receive nuclear and toxic waste in exchange for money.
We do not like nuclear waste to come to our islands. We have already been irradiated.
The American military now uses this area to test weapons that are part of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars program. Has the response from the United States been enough, given what has happened to the people there?
I do very much regret the consequences as they have been manifest in both illness and loss. I conscientiously reject the notion that the United States had evil intent in the Marshalls.
Their geography, not their politics or their military, dragged the Marshallese into World War II, their only experience with war. Then the nuclear testing began. High levels of radiation have made much of the land uninhabitable, forced many from their homes, altered their tides, contaminated their fish. The United States has openly recognized the horrors of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But not so with the Marshall Islands, where 66 devices exploded. Today, the Marshallese are gently fighting for their lives. Once a U.S. trust, they've won independent nation status. Despite the devastation the Americans brought to this peaceful island nation, the Marshallese harbor no ill will. Savages? Hardly.
One spring night, almost 24 years ago, a towering figure of America's civil rights struggle was struck down as he stood on the balcony of a Memphis motel.
Just as Martin Luther King Jr. was too important to forget, so is the cause for which he fought and died. That's why a tragic spot in Memphis has been transformed into a place to remember.
When I got down to Memphis, my baby moved on her down the line. So I find myself here on Beale Street, and I'm still crying.
These are the street musicians of Beale Street in the heart of Memphis, Tennessee. They sing the sad songs of life's ups and downs, rights and wrongs, and the daily struggle for survival. Beale Street speaks with the rhythm of the blues, but just up the road on Mulberry Street, there's a different song that's being sung.
Amazing grace.
It's a hymn that echoes back to the dark days of slavery and the black man's struggle for freedom and equality in America. On this night, people of all kindreds and tongues sing with one voice to commemorate the opening of the National Civil Rights Museum. The museum is housed on the site of the infamous Lorraine Motel, the exact location where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was slain on April 4th, 1968. The museum is the dream fulfilled of D'Army Bailey and others from the local community who banded together in 1982 to purchase the dilapidated motel at a foreclosure sale for $144,000. After several years of fundraising, the Lorraine Civil Rights Museum Foundation raised the more than $10 million needed from private and government funds to turn a once neglected motel into an attention-grabbing museum devoted to telling the story of the civil rights movement in America.
This first gallery is entitled Unremitting Struggle, and it's a historical timeline that begins in 1619 and ends in 1865. It is a historical timeline that provides information to all of us to show us that the civil rights movement did not begin with the 1954 Supreme Court decision.
Many of the exhibits here at the Civil Rights Museum are interactive. That means that the visitors get a chance to experience firsthand what the civil rights struggle was all about. Take, for instance, this exhibit that represents the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. If you were black and wanted to ride on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama during the 1950s and chose to sit here at the front seat, this is what you would have been told.
Please move to the back of the bus. I need that seat now. Please move back. If you don't move out of that seat, I'll have you arrested. Get up from there.
The accurate telling of a sometimes forgotten history is the reason the museum exists. Studies indicate that even though the modern civil rights movement occurred as recently as the 1950s and 60s, fewer than 1/3 of all Americans will have first-hand knowledge of the events that transpired.
A lot of what's happening now with people our age is that because we weren't around to experience how bad things were, that we tend, I think, for one, to take things for granted, and for another to tend to, I think, underestimate how bad things can become again if we're not careful.
The museum's directors called upon the expertise of Ben Lawless, a former director of exhibitions at the Smithsonian, to recreate the pivotal points in the civil rights struggle and pay homage to the individuals who made equality possible.
And you know, whites in the movement in the South sometimes experience even greater wrath of the racists than did the blacks. Well, because the whites resented what they saw as one of their own, crossing the line and hooking arms, embracing the struggle of the black people in the South at the time. They saw them as traitors, nigger lovers they called them.
The media's impact on the civil rights movement is prominently displayed. Many journalists risk their lives to tell the whole story, a courageousness with which a modern journalist wrestles.
I think that those people had that courage because of many of the things they knew about and witnessed, and for them, I'm sure it was frightening, but I haven't had to do any of the kinds of things that they've had to do, so it would be a much more difficult thing for me to do.
Grace Austin Meacham was one of the courageous students who engaged in the sit-ins to integrate the nation's libraries, theaters, and lunch counters.
Well, we thought how criminal it was to deny us access to public facilities that our parents paid to maintain and operate, to build, first of all, maintain and operate, because tax money went into the public library, and this is where our movement began rather than the lunch counter.
But I'm sorry, our regiment does not allow to serve niggers in here.
Exposing history's harsh light can be both painful and cathartic.
I want people, when they go to the King Rooms, to get some spiritual nourishment, to sort of have a symbiotic interaction with the spirit of King.
It helped me feel like I was more a part of the situation rather than just reading about it and not really identifying with it. I felt like I was there.
Feeling like you were there does not compare to the experience of actually being there. Taylor Rogers remembers when he was a striking sanitation worker in 1968, and Dr. King made his ill-fated trip to Memphis to encourage the weary workers.
Well, when Dr. King came, the strike was already established. He came because the men had started getting weary, some going back to work, and we couldn't have that. So he came in as a morale builder, and that's what he did. Those guys were going back. We had prayer meeting with them, and we got them back off those jobs.
The Civil Rights Museum is not without its controversy. The reef behind me marks the exact location where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was slain on April 4th, 1968. Directly across the street, Jacqueline Smith exercises her civil rights by protesting the museum's existence here at the Lorraine Motel.
I'm not against the concept of a civil rights museum. I just don't believe it belongs at the Lorraine Motel. This is a land-grabbing conspiracy. The Lorraine itself has history. It was a black-owned business, and we don't own it anymore. I resent the fact that the state of Tennessee has stolen our history, and now they're trying to sell it back to us. There is a $5 admission fee, and I think that will discriminate against the disadvantaged.
Despite Jacqueline Smith's 24-hour vigil, the museum continues to grow in popularity and impact. What's happening in Memphis today are the harvest of the first fruits of the civil rights movement. African Americans are employed in positions once shut out, and they're owners of establishments that used to close their doors to them. The doors of the National Civil Rights Museum are open to all people. Those who enter through with a shackled mind usually exit with a new liberation. Clarence Thomas sits on the United States Supreme Court, the youngest person and the second African American in history to do so.
However, his nomination, the dramatic confirmation hearings, and ultimate appointment created a firestorm of controversy, especially within the black community, pitting those favoring a bootstrap approach against those who say government has a responsibility, creating a nation truly divided. When Oklahoma law professor Anita Hill and federal district judge Clarence Thomas took center stage before the Senate Judiciary Committee, the whole world was watching. At stake was not simply the reputations of two African Americans, but the integrity of the entire black community. The debate was no longer one of philosophical or ideological differences. Under some rather unexpected circumstances, allegations of sexual harassment were raised. Anita Hill, a former colleague, said that while working at the Department of Education and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Thomas, then her boss, sexually harassed her. So what had been a debate over politics became a debate over perception.
I think Anita Hill was telling the truth. I really do. I think she waited too long to bring it forth.
And there is no absolute proof that he actually did it. And I don't believe he's the type of person that would say those sort of things.
This wasn't the first time American TV viewers had watched the character of black role models called into question. Recently, we watched the private life of Marion Barry, former mayor of Washington, D.C., unfold before cameras. But this was one of the first times the black community didn't give one of its brothers an automatic pass. This time, there were no cries of assault on black leadership.
Both sides of this issue, Anita Hill, who was being exploited by the women's liberation movement, and Clarence Thomas, who is being exploited by the Republican Party and the blacks who side with the Republican Party in this neoconservative movement in America. So what you had really was two blacks being manipulated by wings of white supremacy.
When President George Bush announced that Clarence Thomas was his choice for Supreme Court nominee, African Americans immediately took sides.
We represent 14.2 African American citizens, and we are here to assert, to proclaim, and to declare our strong opposition to the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas.
Like most veterans of the Civil Rights Movement, these ministers and others were wary of who might fill Justice Thurgood Marshall's shoes. When Justice Marshall announced his retirement, he included a warning. Many believe the warning was almost prophetic, especially after the White House announced Marshall's replacement.
My dad told me way back that you can't use race. For example, there's no difference between a white snake and a black snake. They're both bite.
So why wasn't Clarence Thomas embraced by the African American community? After all, he had come from Pinpoint, Georgia, to the pinnacle of a career. At risk was not the advancement of one person, but the social gains of an entire people, and the belief that this one person could be instrumental in turning back the clock.
He is one of the most decent people I've ever known. And the huge lie about this man not being committed to black people is a travesty of justice. It just does not wash. But ladies and gentlemen, we would not be discussing Clarence Thomas if he were liberal and a Democrat. His crime is he is a Republican and he is conservative.
We have an individual who obviously has a compelling personal background, who overcame some very difficult personal circumstances. And we have an individual who has demonstrated that he is academically gifted, he's bright, and he has applied himself in a way that, to some degree, I think we should all be proud of. At the same time, Judge Thomas has advanced his political career in a manner where he has subscribed to policies and positions that, if applied across the board, indeed would be hostile to the interests of African Americans.
The very difficult personal circumstances that Henderson refers to is Thomas's childhood in the rural South, who was raised by his grandparents. Thomas's grandfather was a small businessman and apparently instilled in his grandson a strong work ethic.
Daddy was a strong-minded person and demanding a little bit, and he was determined for us to get what he didn't ever get.
From the time Clarence Thomas was nominated, the administration played up the nominee's humble beginnings. In fact, on the first day of the confirmation hearings, Thomas himself chronicled for the Judiciary Committee what life was like in the Deep South. But was Thomas's life one of struggle? Even on this point, the black community is in disagreement.
Except for the first 7 years of his life, Clarence Thomas, let us not be dismayed, lived a life better than most black people in this country. Here's somebody who was plucked up, put into a private school, and then went to college, and then plucked out of there and put here, and then plucked there and put in the corporate structure, and then plucked there and put in Washington, and then plucked there, and now he's going to be plucked all the way to the Supreme Court. Now what kind of a tough life is that?
And it's the attractive packaging of Poor Boy Makes Good that's partly responsible for the debate. This is a room of journalists, public relations workers, and concerned citizens.
The Horatio Alger myth plays very well. Why does it play well? Because it confirms in 1991 not so much the mythology of black people, because most of us in this room came up like Clarence Thomas. What it confirms is the mythology of the white community, that here in 1991 is a confirmation of my ideology, that somebody can sort of make it on their own all the way to the Supreme Court without any help.
In fact, it's a common belief in the black community that President Bush chose Thomas not only to stack the court, but to create division within the black community. White House spokesperson Connie Newman, who is a part of the inner circle which chose Thomas, rebukes the notion the administration had any malice.
That doesn't make any sense. The fact that a group of black Republicans within and outside of the administration went to the president because we strongly believe that Justice Marshall's position should be filled by another African American, and we felt the best candidate was Judge Thomas. We didn't have any discussions with anybody about how to cause turmoil.
Newman has known Thomas for 10 years. She also knew Justice Marshall. Newman admits to their differences, but says at this stage in history, Americans don't have the luxury of excluding anyone's ideas.
Many of the problems of African Americans in terms of their standing, economic empowerment is worse in many instances than in the past, which suggests to me that all of the strategies of the past have not worked, and that maybe we need to look at alternatives to addressing some of those problems.
It seems that everyone who knows Clarence Thomas likes him. After he left the EEOC, employees petitioned to have the headquarters in downtown Washington named after him. Thomas became director of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1982.
I've worked under every director at EEOC.
Willie King has worked at the agency since 1966. Previously, King worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under the direction of Martin Luther King Jr. She had been working on the Civil Rights Act and was familiar with Title VII.
In South Georgia, for instance, there was no place my parents, my cousins, and what have you there could file a complaint unless they found a way to get all the way to Atlanta. People didn't know about EEOC. I'm talking about people that I saw marching, people that had relatives killed and what have you in the movement. They didn't benefit one darn bit from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. But when Clarence Thomas came aboard, he made sure that our expanded presence got to those communities, where those people too could benefit from Title VII. That to me is very important. That tells me we will have a friend in the courts.
Civil rights lawyer Elaine Jones says the debate was never over whether Thomas is a nice person.
Because we're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States. We're not talking about being a State Department and ambassador or a greeter at the White House. We're talking about somebody who's going to the Supreme Court of the United States to decide cases. So what is important to us as a people is to be his judicial philosophy and how he thinks, what he thinks about the Constitution and our civil rights.
It was difficult to tell if the sentiment of those who were a part of the so-called movement was mirrored on a grassroots level. The major media conducted polls that showed Thomas ahead by a margin of 3-2. Just how accurate were these polls? Even Levita Coleman, a close friend of Thomas's, says she couldn't tell whose interpretation was correct, the white media or the black community.
I listen a great deal to the public radio station here that is mostly black commentators, and I've been fascinated with the difference of their perception of the appointment from that of your mainstream white media, the Washington Post, the New York Times.
But in the heartland, specifically Chicago, there's only one poll that counts, and that's the one conducted every day on WVON's open phone lines. VON, which stands for Voice of the Negro, is the oldest black talk radio station in the country. Here, the opinions of the black community are welcomed, and callers have no problems speaking their minds. On the day we were at the station, for every one caller for Thomas, 3 were in opposition.
But I think that the man is warped. Not to be able to see.
Warped?
Warped.
You didn't call him warped.
Well, anyone who is an opportunist who will advance his own social and economic conditions at the misery of the people has to be warped.
What character of jurist Clarence Thomas will ultimately be remains to be seen. Whether anything good comes of the Thomas debates also remains to be seen.
Young African Americans do want to be accepted for their talent and for their ability, and they should be. But at the same time, I think they have to recognize as well that the interests that we all share have got to be protected, and that having an individual who is prepared to speak truth to power is often more important than having an individual who's black.
Out of the confirmation process arose 2 issues that began a national dialogue. What is sexual harassment, and whether the civil rights movement has helped or hurt blacks. And on both of these, the jury is still out.
We need to stop arguing over the white supremacy-based interests of other people and come and fight for our own interests politically, economically, socially, culturally in America. That is the direction that I think the African American community is moving in as I observe the black masses throughout America. We've tried everybody, let's try ourselves.
As we know, Clarence Thomas took his place on the Supreme Court last November, just in time for the High Court's fall session.
Many of Thomas's supporters call themselves conservatives. They reject most of the traditional civil rights leadership programs and rhetoric.
They say there's a better way for African Americans to realize full equality and economic prosperity. Street Life correspondent Sherma Wise has the story of black conservatives and their promise of progress.
Senator, I can't name, again, it's sitting here, all the groups that I've met with. But
I think that Clarence Thomas, his nomination and his confirmation, basically is a victory for one point of view. And that is the point of view that says that the black community is as diverse in its political thinking and thought as any other community. And that one, by definition, does not have to be of this stripe in order to make it. That you can make it in this country by being an out-of-the-mainstream thinker.
J. Kenneth Blackwell is one of the growing number of black conservatives stepping forward and offering opinions which differ from those of traditional black leadership. Blackwell, a Republican, is the former mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio. He's a member of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, and is currently the United States representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. He says conservatives have been unjustly accused of maintaining the status quo and not helping blacks.
I think it would be a mistake to define conservatives as wanting to preserve the status quo, and if that status quo has been oppressive or repressive for blacks, all of a sudden anyone who identifies himself as a conservative thinker, as a conservative in a political sense, is by definition then against the interests of black people.
Do you think that there will be a trend for more blacks to move into the conservative ranks?
And I think there are many blacks who don't go around and call themselves conservatives, don't wear a conservative badge on his or her lapel, but who by the way they carry themselves and the things that they feel or deem important are already conservatives.
Gary Franks is a first-term Republican congressman from Connecticut. Yes, he's a conservative. He joined the Republican Party because he says it stands for 3 ideals very important to him.
God, country, and family. God, because the Republican Party always talked about being in support of a moment of silence in school. I'm a very strong advocate of that. I see no reason why we cannot have a moment of silence and or prayer in school. Country, because I believe that the best defense is a strong offense. And the Republican Party always looked at that as being the way in which we should approach our foreign policy. Family, the Republican Party always talked about self-sufficiency. The Republican Party always talked about trying to get blacks into positions as vice presidents of companies and presidents of their own businesses versus being an executive director of a social program.
Lon Walls is a Republican and Director of Media Relations and Special Projects for the Department of Transportation. The political appointee says he was an independent.
And I think that we have to understand that, we are the ones who are going to make the difference, and that we have to embrace the principles and the parties that are going to be able the ones to make the change, and not be reluctant to do it.
Some black conservatives say there are more black conservatives than traditional black leadership would like to admit.
Franks says he's done surveys to determine just how conservative blacks are.
I'm conservative, and I believe that on the whole, when tested, most black people would also be rather conservative.
I think a lot of us, fail to realize that blacks are relatively conservative by nature anyway. I mean, we believe in strict, law enforcement, strong church and family values, and those are the kinds of things that sometimes are thrown into the conservative tank, so to speak. So there are a lot of values, I guess, within the Republican Party that we embrace, whether we want to admit it openly or not.
Still, black conservatives have long been ostracized by the mainstream black community.
And some traditional blacks feel that black conservatives have in effect sold out. What's your response to that?
That's nonsense. I've tried to refute that by saying, look, one of the great emancipators, Frederick Douglass, historically recognized by the African American community as being a progressive force in our history, by a broader definition, was conservative. He believed in some very basic traditional values, and he wanted to preserve and conserve those values in our daily lives.
This is Indianapolis, Indiana. Population just under 1 million.
The one thing that sets Indianapolis's political community apart from that of other major metropolitan areas is that it's not unusual to be black and a Republican here.
Indianapolis sports attorney Milton Thompson is just one example. He's a former deputy prosecutor and is on the transition team of the newly elected Republican Mayor Stephen Goldsmith. Like most blacks, Thompson was raised in a family of Democrats, but says his decision to become a Republican was initially for career reasons.
When I was a bailiff in law school, I happened to work for a Republican judge, and his recommendations for my first employment after law school was to a Republican prosecutor, and worked in that administration, was accommodated for political ideology as well as for other activity, particularly in my career, and was given a significant amount of support, and thus became my party of choice.
Mayor Stephen Goldsmith says the city of Indianapolis has been successful in getting blacks involved in the Republican Party because the Democrats have taken blacks for granted.
And in some big cities, like Indianapolis, the Republican Party began to be more responsive, more open, and offering opportunities. So we've seen some movement, especially among middle-class folks, back to the Republican Party, I think.
One of the many issues dividing conservatives and liberals is affirmative action and quotas. The black conservatives we talk to say blacks don't want to be treated special, just fairly.
Most of today's affirmative action programs are in fact geared towards blacks that are at the most disadvantaged position in our community. Most affirmative action programs for those who have corporate jobs paying $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 a year have absolutely zero meaning to the families that I work with in public housing.
All we want is an equal opportunity. That's been the problem in America, is getting an equal opportunity, not getting preferential treatment.
Black conservatives say what blacks don't need is another social welfare program for them to depend on. They say what they need are self-help programs, which challenge the traditional liberal model of government-based solutions.
A liberal would see a person drowning 50 foot offshore, throw him a 100-foot rope, and then drop his end to find something else good to do. A conservative would see that same person drowning 50 feet offshore, throw him a 25-foot rope because the swim would do him good. You know, what the masses of black people want are people that would throw that person a 50-foot rope, hold on to his end, and get a job done.
Our Street Life Roundtable discussion will focus on the growing influence black conservatives are making in the African American community and what direction that influence is taking. Joining us tonight is Julia Malvo, economist, syndicated columnist for King Features, contributing editor to Essence Magazine, contributing editorial columnist for USA Today, and Lee Walker, Justice Thomas's point man in Illinois. He's a business executive who started as a clerk and went on to become one of the brightest African-American business administrators in the country. I guess I want to start with you, Mr. Walker. We ended that piece with the saying, get the job done. What is it going to take for black conservatives to get the job done?
I think we need to be far more honest with ourselves and the community as black conservatives. I think we need to move away from the whole discussion on affirmative action, because that is a divisive point within the black community. We need to talk about equal opportunity. We need to talk about removing the glass ceiling. We need to talk about equal opportunity, period. We need to talk about quality education rather than busing. And this is what I think the black conservatives should be doing in the future.
But let me, you say that you don't want to talk about affirmative action because it's divisive in the black community. Most African Americans have benefited. It's not only at the college level, but you have plenty of construction workers who would not have jobs in construction were it not for consent decrees and other things. I think it's divisive when you have a president who uses the word quota repeatedly when the word quota is inappropriate. I think it's divisive when you have black Republicans who would like to let us think the system works, and therefore, even though you have a civil rights bill that has been constantly eroded by Supreme Court decisions. And finally, I think I take real exception to the piece in where Gary Frank says conservatives are about family, church, and country, as if liberals are not. We come from families too. Liberals are not just sitting on the sidewalk waiting to be picked up somewhere. So to use those words, family, God, country, and to use them as a divider, I think is inappropriate. It's false advertising, and it speaks to me to the character erosion on the part of so many conservatives.
You wrote a piece on the fact that you think that this conservatism is a new frontier for black men, in essence, to prove to white men that they still can be their equal. Or it's the last frontier to prove that.
Exactly. The notion of black and white, it's not black, white in racial terms, but the notion of something being very absolute seems to me to be something uniquely male. The notion of looking at some of the complexities and shadings seems to have a more female connotation. And I have not seen women in the front lines of the conservative movement. I think primarily among African Americans. I think that primarily is because the shading is so harsh that it's difficult for people to buy into it.
Julianne, I say this in all sincerity. I think it's very dangerous when educated blacks fail to distinguish true history. It's dangerous for us to do that. American conservatism, as far as blacks are concerned, it's part of our history from slavery right through Reconstruction, right up to the 40s. When I use that term, we're not talking about politics or George Bush or Ronald Reagan. We're talking about, in the black community, we were founded and based on religion, the church, education, or achievement, character.
Democrat or Republican, Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, African American people, yes, have strong family values and are founded on the church. I think what's dangerous is to have these people suggest and imply that love of family and love of country are uniquely conservative attributes and that they have no liberal, radical, or other components.
The other thing is, though, we're getting away a little bit because you still haven't addressed the fact that many of the people who are part of the conservative movement are people, especially in the African American community, who have benefited from some of the same programs that now we're hearing people talk against. And so we still need to know, because there have been advances made because of affirmative action. So what would you replace some of these programs with?
I would argue that we are beyond civil rights now. And as Darrell asked me earlier, what is the mission of the new conservative movement in this country? And I would argue that I think we are winning because we are debating conservative thinking issues at this point.
What are you winning?
If we're beyond civil rights, then where are we? I mean, does that mean that there's still not prejudice? Does that mean that there's equality across the board? When two people go to a job and one's black and one's white and they're equally qualified?
No. And I think we're being oversimplistic with that point. What I'm talking about, in the 50s and the 60s, there were laws on the books, unjust laws. Those laws have been removed. What I'm saying again is that in the 1990s, there are obstacles out there standing in the front of blacks, keeping them from joining the mainstream other than race. And we have to look at all of those issues.
But race remains an obstacle, and I think that too many black conservatives would like to ignore the fact that race remains an obstacle. In the year 1991, there are just so many incidents in which race was a factor. There was an Urban Institute study done in Chicago where literally they did matched pairs of black and white young men, sending them to employers and finding that the blacks were 3 times as likely, identically qualified to be turned away as the whites. We found Primetime Live followed that up with a segment where they took a young black man and a young white man into a city and followed them through the minutia of their life, trying to buy a CD, trying to buy a pair of shoes to find the differential treatment. So I think that you conservatives are lying to yourselves when you say that race is not a factor. Clarence Thomas tried to get a cab to his own Supreme Court hearings and could not get one because he was black, had to ask a white man to get one for him. And then he sat there and lied.
Let's not build a straw man. Prior to what you said, also in his town, Bill Wilson, who's not a Republican, does not consider himself a conservative, wrote a book, The Declining Significance of Racism.
Or race. How exactly is the conservative movement going to fight the growing trend now within the Democratic community to go and be very vocal about crime in the streets and really adopt what usually were conservative platforms also in terms of cutting national and government spending?
Darrell, again, let me say, I do not limit conservatism to the Republican Party. I mean, this is not a party issue. As I said, I use it as an adjective, conservative thinking. There are conservative thinking Democrats. As a matter of fact, last night on a new show on another channel was showing a black judge in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were calling him a conservative. He's a Democrat. And the reason they were calling him a conservative because there is a perception out there. If blacks do not go with the stated positions, you are called a conservative. We must allow different voices and different solutions, be tried.
But are the two ends working together? Are the two wings going to work together, or are we going to still have conservatives who say, and to answer this quickly, that the civil rights leaders are out of touch with the community?
I think the two ends must work together.
But I think that the rhetoric of the conservative movement has been incredibly divisive in the black community. It serves nothing to say that the civil rights leaders are out of step with the rest of the community. Conservatives don't know who the rest of the community are, and they represent a minority of the black community.
Unfortunately, our roundtable must end at this time. However, this growing movement in the black community is sure to provoke more discussion and controversy in the months ahead, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight.
The name game goes on every time a child is born. Should he or she be named after a relative or a saint? What about a name that has deep meaning or no meaning at all? Something that sounds nice.
A name can leave a lasting impression. It can be a legacy or a label. Street Life correspondent Bob Long takes a lighthearted look at what's in a name.
Each of those precious little babies lying in this nursery has or soon will receive its most personal possession, its name. And what responsibility do we as parents have when naming our children? Should we pick a name simply because it's something we like? Or pick something that society says is in vogue at the time? Or do we try to pick a name that we think fits the child? What value do names have? Or will just anything do?
American names run the gamut, from the mundane to the, let's say, unusual.
The most unusual name I've heard has been Asatu.
Wybonia.
Echo.
Kujikanjalia. Yeah, Kujikanjalia.
Syphilis. That was the most bizarre that I've ever seen or heard of, and that the mother was quite adamant about it.
No matter how you spell or pronounce them, names like syphilis and gonorrhea look and sound like diseases. Embarrassing diseases. Going through life answering to one of these names can be quite debilitating, to say the least.
Parents should think about the names that they give their children, although it may sound beautiful to them and flowery at the time, but is the child going to be able to deal with the name and appreciate the name?
Whether in the classroom or the schoolyard, most children are subject to a certain amount of teasing anyway. Time was, a boy named George could almost count on being taunted with jeers of Georgie Borgie. Even unisex names like Francis, Pat, and Leslie can open the door to playful harassment.
It was pretty tough because all of the tough guys were named Sam and James and so forth, and Leslie was, they would pronounce it Leslie, and with my trying to make a difference, by saying Leslie, I thought it made it more masculine, but it really didn't.
Dr. Patman says youngsters with unisex names should expect some kind of criticism. But despite this risk, a considerable number of today's yuppie couples are deliberately choosing unisex names for their children. The aim is to avoid another risk: sex discrimination. By avoiding names that are strictly male or female, they hope their children's job applications will be judged by their qualifications and not by their sex.
In my job, I would probably make the first judgment based upon their qualifications and whether or not they were somebody that we ought to be looking at for the organization based upon the skills they bring. I would never screen out anyone based upon their name.
Even so, George Smith understands the concerns of today's professional couples. He's the director of human resources at the Museum of Science and Industry, and he's also conducting genealogical research on names. Historically, he says, names are influenced by a number of basic factors like religion. Old and New Testament names like Samuel.
We're trying to think of something that was like a good, solid name and had a little bit of meaning, too.
And what the meaning is?
Just, both my grandfathers are great men.
Which brings up another influence, family tradition. Little Sam perpetuates a long line of proud namesakes, but on rare occasions, one name dominates the same generation of the family line.
I have 5. Ricky Harris, Diane Harris, Deborah Harris, Richard Harris the first, Richard Harris the second, and Richard Harris the third.
Sometimes parents start a new tradition.
My middle name is Christine, so I wanted something that sounds, had something like Chris in it, so I came up with Christopher from Christine.
Daryl and Charlene Schillers searched through books to find a name for their daughter, but they found the names to be too common. They wanted something different, so they settled on Alora Janita.
Alora was a name that we had heard when we were watching a movie, and it kind of stuck with us. We thought about different names that we could name her, and as a female, for the female, that name stuck with us. Janita is a combination of my mom's name and her mom's name. Charlene's mom is Janet, and my mom's name is Juanita, so that's how we came about Janita.
From her desk at the records department at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Jackie Smith has seen a variety of trendy names come and go.
When Linda Evans was popular in Dynasty, we all of a sudden started seeing a lot of Crystals. That seems to have petered out a little now, though. Crystal's not on anymore, so we don't have any more Crystals. But we see a lot of names that aren't the real common names showing up, such as Shannon, Morgans, Brittany's.
George Smith's research has also unearthed what he calls phonic names, names pronounced differently than they are spelled, like Female.
That doesn't tell you much until you realize it's spelled F-E-M-A-L-E, like female.
Unique, but it still doesn't quite make Smith's "Can you top this?" category.
They appear to just be a bunch of letters put together. They don't seem to fit any patterns of phonics or language that are known.
Shaliquia. Latasha.
Tyanika.
These names aren't to be confused with what Smith calls Afrocentric names, names that reflect African heritage in an authentic African language. Like most parents intent upon an African name for their baby, Dorian and Sheila Jones did their homework before reaching their final decision.
To, like I said, be a 21st century baby or person, he would have to be brilliant. He would have to be a warrior.
And so, they named their son Kamal Ari, translated, brilliant warrior.
The Africans, when they named their children, they named them with a purpose. And their tradition was that the child should grow into the name, or the child should earn the name.
Noted African-American historian Dr. Margaret Burroughs is one of the foremost experts in her field and has traveled many times to Africa. But she adamantly refuses to change her own name and has even written a poem explaining why.
And why haven't I taken a name which no one can pronounce? Why haven't I taken a name which no one can spell? I am acting in the tradition of my true African-American heritage. My parents deliberated long and carefully before they bestowed my names on me, so I will not disrespect or dishonor the action of my parents. I will not disrespect or dishonor the spirit of my parents. I will not degrade the memory of my Aunt Margaret. I will not degrade the memory of Grandmother Victoria. My name is Margaret Victoria, and I'm trying to live up to the fine qualities invoked by my name.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Street Life. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to all those who helped make this show possible.
Join us next time when we look at the experiences of African immigrants in the U.S., the new African Americans, and explore new theories on the origin of man. For Street Life, I'm Delmarie Cobb.
And I'm Darrell Dennard. Good night.
Good night. So, Darrell, what's the most unusual name you've ever heard?
Well, it'd have to be my great-uncle Darrell Jefferson Johnson Jackson Lincoln Dennard.
No, I have a brother-in-law with the same name.
This program is a production of Delaco Communications, which is solely responsible for its content.
Street Life has been made possible in part by Garthco Push magazine, for those who want to stay well informed, coming to a newsstand near you. If you would like a videocassette copy of this or any other edition of Street Life, send 1995 to Delaco Communications, 28 East Jackson, Suite 1101, Chicago, Illinois, 60604, or call 312-939-7740.